Zack Wilson, reading from Tree Killer Inc. number 10. They all took it very hard. News of James Tattoo's demise filtered slowly into the Green Man. Initial reports had suggested that he was on the run after an episode of possibly lethal violence during a night out in Burton-on-Trent. Whether that was true or not was never confirmed by anyone. The police were, after all, always on the lookout for James, asking questions, and the Green Man's collective reflex response was to tell anyone who was asking that they didn't know. Few people did actually know anything about James beyond what he did when he was in the pub anyway. He wasn't really a bloke with whom to share tender family intimacies. It was when someone saw in a local newspaper that the identity of a murdered body found in Swadlincote had been confirmed as that of Shane James Jones, formerly of Aspie de la Zouche, that the news hit everyone very hard. No one had known that his real name was Shane, but the police mugshot published alongside the report was clearly James Tattoo. The paper said that he'd been stabbed by a schizophrenic, named as Adrian Bedford, who up until a point some 6 months before had been living a quiet life as a local government clerical officer. But then his job had come under threat with a coalition government in power, so he'd taken voluntary redundancy and rediscovered a ketamine habit that had been 10 years dormant. Adrian had liked listening to film soundtracks very loud and very late, so James had gone round to his house and thrown several violent temper tantrums, at one stage grabbing Adrian around the head and performing an aggressive, squeezing dance-type manoeuvre with him for a minute or two. Adrian had taken that very hard. So he waited another 3 or 4 hours after James had marked his exit by slamming him round into the wall, long enough for James to have drunk himself insensible with vodka. Then he'd gone round to his house and stabbed his neighbour in the heart whilst he snored, according to the newspaper anyway, making use of the accuracy with a point he'd acquired during a successful schoolboy fencing career in Stratford-upon-Avon. They'd all taken it very hard in the Green Man when they'd read the newspaper report. They'd all drunk long into the Tuesday night, with Stuart the landlord labelling the after-hours session as a tribute lock-in for James Tattoo, even though there was a lock-in for regulars every night. They drank lots of cider, because they said it was James's drink, but most of them would have been drinking it anyway, because Strongbow was on offer on Tuesday nights. 1 or 2 of them were in tears by the early hours, and 1 or 2 of them were vomiting out back. They'd all taken it very hard. James had a brother in Leeds who'd come down with a biscuit tin to leave in the pub for a collection for the dead man's kids. He was promised that he'd collect it in a month, and it would be stuffed full of cash. When he returned a few weeks later, he pretended to be grateful for the couple of handfuls of change that were rattling disappointingly in the tin. People knew that Stuart had emptied it one night for money for the one-armed bandit, but no one said anything. After all, Stuart had taken it very hard. A crowd did meet up in the pub on the day they thought the funeral was on. They were actually a week late, but they didn't know that when they decided not to go anyway, and get pissed all day instead, sitting in the Green Man in incongruous shirts and ties, telling each other it was what James would have wanted, though few of them knew anything at all about the man beyond his racism, violence and appetite for cocaine. They'd all taken it very hard though. Later that day the news broke that Stuart's wife had left him as one of the town's few genuine foreigners, a Maltese chap that they all described as a fucking Muslim. Then Ray Doyle had gone mad and killed the landlord's cat. James was nothing more than a cartoon memory of slobbering menace. But by that stage, everyone had taken things very hard, and there was only so much time in the world.